Good morning. This is March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. So, happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Things in the world are quite miserable, as well as in the United States. My topic today is immigration. And in a minute or two, I will get around to talking about the issue and issues in the United States. But let me do a kind of sweep, a global sweep first to contextualize the American situation. So there are 8 billion people, roughly speaking, in the world. Of those 8 billion people, there are about 1 billion, maybe 1.25 billion, 1.5 billion people who would be classified as white people. Everyone else is someone of color. There are considered to be about 250 million immigrants right now worldwide. And or the other way to look at it is 19% of the world population are currently immigrants. Immigration is not just an American issue, but it's a global issue. And especially the sort of racial comments that are being made in the United States, the people who are trying to emigrate, that is to say, to leave their own countries for one reason or another, some are refugees and some are just immigrants. I'll distinguish that in a minute. Are mostly from countries where the population is not white. Although that's not entirely true because there are a lot of, for example, Ukrainian immigrants all over Europe. The wonderful Steve Miller, who works for the Trump administration, and I think it's fair to say that most of the things he says are fairly racist, says, well, if you allow third world people to come, let's say, to the United States, the US will become a third world country. And by third world country, he means non-white, right? Now, the question is, why are so many people moving around the world? And roughly speaking, 30 million people that have left their countries are refugees. And you will recall we've discussed before refugees under the legal post-World War II category of refugees. And since the international refugee laws were written after the Second World War, they focused on the sort of things that were relevant in the Third World War, namely fascism. And fascism had identified people as being undesirable or even potential victims of concentration camps and death, who were of a different religion, a different race, different sexuality, and so on. So that the entire international refugee structure revolved around people who became refugees for political reasons. Now, nowadays, there are still people who are trying to leave countries for political reasons because they believe their lives are at risk. But also, huge numbers of people are leaving for economic reasons. That is to say, they leave their country and they try to land in a different country. Asians, Africans, and so forth. Many of these people don't come from societies where their lives are necessarily at risk, but their livelihoods are at risk. And the irony of the situation of the sort of, the 19% of the world population trying to immigrate somewhere at the moment is that this is not necessarily even a question of extreme poverty. Many of the students of international immigration issues will argue that the fact that even in poor countries, the economic situations have somewhat improved leads people who have some limited resources to try to leave to even better their situation. So, for example, a lot of Africans who are trying to reach Europe, in fact, have to have a fair amount of money to pay the various people they need to pay to try to get them over to Europe, right? So these are not necessarily the most impoverished people, but rather people who live in relatively poor countries, see no future for themselves, but have become sufficiently affluent to imagine that they can, in a sense, pay their way into other societies. And I emphasize this because the argument is often made, that people who are refugees are necessarily people at death's door. Sometimes that is true, but in the economic side of things, many people who are slightly upwardly mobile, young adults, for example, who are slightly upwardly mobile, are in fact a factor of improved economic circumstances rather than worsening economic circumstances, even if the political situation in their country is less than ideal and their countries are authoritarian. Other people who are refugees and qualify under regular refugee status, that is to say, under the political umbrella of refugees, are, for example, the Rohingya, the people of the Muslim people in Myanmar, who are kicked out because of their religion and ethnicity. And, for example, Bangladesh has 1 million Myanmar refugees in refugee camps. So those kinds of things also exist in the world. And those people qualify under refugee status in the old-fashioned sense, namely that their lives are at risk. So there is a dividing line between people whose lives are at risk, who qualify under the old post-World War II criteria refugees, and those people who are wanting to leave for economic circumstances, sometimes because, as I said, the economic circumstances have slightly bettered. At other times, people's economic circumstances become non-viable in their own countries because of climate change. Many in, for example, Central America, who were small farmers of one kind or another, can no longer make a living on their farms and then try to seek better vistas for themselves and their families, and then traipse up north and try to enter the United States. Those people don't qualify under international refugee law, but increasingly are a large component of people seeking hospitable opportunities elsewhere because they don't, they can't manage under their own circumstances. Now, the refugee and immigration issue has become a worldwide issue. And it's a worldwide issue throughout Europe, throughout parts of Asia, Japan, other places, because, of course, people come from other cultures and other societies, and especially fairly homogeneous countries, don't like people who speak other languages and so on. So there is a political opposition that has risen, especially on the political right, throughout, for example, European countries, which have had genuine, under the old idea of refugees, political refugees from Turkey, Afghanistan, and so forth, who thought their lives were at risk at various times, enter the countries. But also some of the people who have of other cultures were not, whether it's in Scandinavia or the Western Europe, were not necessarily people who originally had impossible circumstances at home, but people who were attracted to employment and jobs. And particularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, countries like Germany and Switzerland and so forth needed labor and invited laborers to come from Turkey, for example, in some of Western Europe. And those folks, many of them didn't choose to want to return and are still gainfully employed in automobile industries, as shop clerks, and so on. But it has, in a sense, eroded the monolithic as ideas of everybody speaking a single language, everybody, looking German in Germany, in terms of Western conception of white people and so forth. So over the years, the ever increasing number of people who have landed in Scandinavia, landed in Western Europe, have created anti-immigration sentiment, especially amongst right-wing people. And you can have seen, if you follow the news, that in the recent German election, for example, the right wing picked up a lot of votes. And not all of that, but much of it is based on anti-immigration sentiment. So the idea of the world becoming more mixed and people moving around for a variety of reasons and causalities has become a political issue in many countries. And how this will all play itself out is not clear. But what is clear, it seems to me, that in this century, almost all countries, industrial countries now, will increasingly, as their population age, need additional labor from elsewhere in the world. So the necessity of having people from other countries, other cultures, other languages will ever increase. That does not mean that the political opposition to having them will in some ways decrease. But it is a kind of international issue right now, which people are not willing to confront, especially as we confront climate change and population aging in some societies, and therefore needing labor. I emphasize Europe, but this is also an issue in Japan, for example, which is the most rapidly aging societies. They absolutely need labor from elsewhere. And having just visiting labor doesn't work entirely well. I mean, people come on contracts, but then they marry, then their children are born there, and so forth. So we have a big international 20th century issue that is not being addressed well, and has had a conservative and right-wing backlash at the moment that a lot of countries are contending with. So let me now turn to the United States. We are known as a nation of immigrants, along with Canada, Australia, and so on. And we have a history of discriminating against new immigrants, which predates the current era. I think I've mentioned before that in the 1950s, for example, there was a lot of anti-Italian and anti-Irish sentiment in New York, in Boston, and elsewhere. Because people were Catholic rather than Protestant, people had dialects, people had other cultures, ate other foods, etc. So the sort of anti-immigrant notion, when waves of people come, either as refugees or as, legal immigrants under various immigration laws, has been an issue, a historical issue in the United States. And I don't have the time really to go through, all the various rules and regulations of the 20th century. But before the 20th century, people could just arrive in the United States. After that, we had immigration laws, and the immigration laws were often quite racist, small quotas for people who are not of European origin, and so forth and so on. And it wasn't just Europe versus non-Europeans. I mean, anti-Polish sentiment, anti-this, anti-that. It isn't exactly new. But the current situation is different and new in some ways, and in part, of course, because so many people had to arrive illegally across the border, because there was no way for them to enter legally. That is to say, they could not really demonstrate in many cases that they fell under post-World War II political refugee status. And being economic refugees didn't count. So lots of people, took it upon themselves to try to cross the border illegally. That, of course, led to the unexpected reaction to those people. I've mentioned before, even in our area, everybody in Watsonville speaks Spanish. These people won't even learn English, and so forth and so on. The fact that the next generation, even of Watsonville immigrants, learns English and is bilingual, etc., is not in the sort of racist notion of things recognized. Generally speaking, almost all the children of immigrants, become Americanized and speak English, go to English-speaking schools. Often, if their parents are smart, they speak a different language at home, so the kids grow up bilingually, which is both a cultural and an occupational advantage. You might have noticed that in almost every doctor's office in Santa Cruz, there's at least one person who can fluently speak Spanish as well as English, and so on. In any event, the idea that all these people are coming illegally and ruin the United States is now a pervasive notion amongst the American public. All the polls indicate that over 50% of the US population is anti-immigrant and supports the idea of having fewer people come to their country. Ironically, of course, the industries, for example, farms, whether it's in the San Joaquin Valley or Salinas or in the Middle West, or all the people who work in cattle and milk production and slaughterhouses, so forth, almost hardly anybody is American born. Now, are all these people illegal? Not necessarily. But it is the case that our economy heavily depends on immigrant labor and will increasingly do so. Why is it that we have 4% unemployment, let's say, when in fact in various industries and agriculture actually are short of labor? Well, it's because they're different people, right? If a white-collar worker gets laid off, they're not going to go to work in a slaughterhouse, for example. And the other issue that has, of course, risen in this sort of wave of anti-immigration sentiment is to remove what is in the 14th Amendment, namely that you're born in the United States, you're an American citizen. So a lot of these people have children, and these children are Americans according to the interpretation of our 14th Amendment that has stood since the 14th Amendment was promulgated. We shall see what now happens if that is being questioned, which it is being questioned by the Trump administration, and will probably wind up at the Supreme Court. So you have mixed families, right? You have legal immigrants who have American-born children, but who are not American citizens yet. You have illegal immigrants who've lived here forever. I think 11 million, as we speak, have American-born children, and so forth. In fact, some of the Trump desired new policies and legislation has some industries, as I said, agriculture and so forth, completely freaked out because they require the labor. It is not just those kinds of industries, but for example, the Californian building industry wouldn't know what to do if it doesn't have labor, right? And many of the laborers that work on building the buildings downtown and everywhere else are in fact originally illegal immigrants working in the United States, and you would not have plumbers and all kinds of people that we all consider to be necessity if that were the case. So now, what in the world is going on now? What is going on now is that the current administration is playing on the anti-immigration sentiment and is, closing the border as much as they possibly can, but also not entertaining legal people potentially legal refugees. For example, any number of people who gave into the notion that you had to apply for refugee status outside the US, and that's also an iffy legal proposition, have had their applications and even their approvals nixed by the current administration. These people did the right thing. They stood online, they applied, they got legal permission to enter the United States, and the Trump administration said, we're not going to honor them. So there seems to be no honest way of entering or meeting American immigration and refugee status at the moment. And people are, as it were, we're saying no more people coming into the United States. That is even affecting, as you might have noticed on the news in the last 24 hours, people who are on specialized visas, green cards, to work in the US. For example, the doctor that was nabbed from a university medical department because she went to Lebanon. I presume she's of Lebanese origin and visited her parents or something, was deported. I mean, she was now let back in. And she had a perfectly certifiable green card. And she was not some, riff-raff, uneducated, laborer to drag on the supposed American economy that the current administration refers to. She was a professional person with a valid green card, and I might just add that a fair number of not just computer people, but also physicians and hospitals all over the country are in fact green card holders, because we do not graduate enough native-born Americans in medical schools. And if it weren't for all the doctors from elsewhere who are perfectly legal and have green cards and now are potentially at risk of getting deported, we would all be in very bad state. So that the notion that on the one hand, if you're illegal, you can be chucked out. On the other hand, if you have a legal green card to work here, you can also be chucked out. And you can be chucked out randomly, not just this doctor who went to Lebanon, but for example, Mr. Khalid, who was part of a pro-Palestinian demonstration in Columbia University, right? He is in jail as we now speak in Louisiana with an 8-month pregnant American citizen wife. He was picked up for, as best as anybody can tell, what would be considered free speech. And under normal circumstances, people who have green cards, or for that matter, anybody in the United States, is entitled to free speech. If they violate a law, if they commit a crime, if they have a criminal history, we can have a discussion about whether those people should be chucked out. But here we have perfectly legal people who are, because they are of non-American birth, and who speak, giving their political views who can be chucked out, whose green cards can be withdrawn. This is scary. We are in a very scary phase. Now, what Trump is doing now, which is the latest thing, is to say, okay, the people that we're getting rid of, the ones that we sent back to Venezuela, even though those people had political reasons in most instances for leaving, that is to say, they were at risk of getting politically prosecuted, for example. The administration, can get rid of them under something called the Alien Agency Emergency Act, the Alien Emergency Act. This was an act you probably heard on the news, which was promulgated in 1793, and has been used 3 times: one, World War I, Second World War II, and that Emergency Act at World War II allowed all the camps for Japanese people and Italians and Germans during Second World War. And as you may know, that the fact that these people were sent to camps who had committed absolutely no crime simply because they were of Japanese origin, for example, or German or Italian origin, was disputed in various Supreme Court cases, and some of these people now got compensation and so forth. So simply rounding up people based on their ethnicity or based on where they came from has been in the past disputed. And the Alien Emergency Act is an act that was meant for wartime, and we're not at war. Now, President Trump said last night on an airplane, "Oh yeah, we are at war against refugees, immigrants, all these illegals, people from Venezuela who all belong to gangs, etc., etc." But this is an inappropriate use of the Alien Emergency Act, number one. And number two, even if you assume that people have a criminal past, they are still entitled to a hearing. That is to say that when we did yesterday of just simply putting 240 or 50 people who are said to belong to a gang, they may very well have belonged to a gang or have in the past or still are part of a gang, but they still deserve hearings because it is perfectly, under our legal system, it is perfectly possible that somebody has a tattoo that is a gang tattoo, which they had put on when they were 13, and they've been an upstanding citizen ever since there, and so forth. So this idea of the government, our government, that we, are part of, acting as if they can do anything they please, treat people anywhere they please, is increasingly being called into question by judges. And of course, the Trump administration says, well, these judges are no good. And they don't have to listen to them. And certainly under a wartime act like the Alien Emergency Act, the court shouldn't even get involved because the president has full authority. Well, hello, we're not in a war. Well, hello, is this an appropriate use of this particular act? Eventually, this will all wind up in the Supreme Court. But in the meantime, what is happening in terms of the US, in terms of immigration, is really one many judges think, and I will go on the record thinking, lawlessness. It is not guaranteeing the rights that humans have under the Constitution or international law. And the US has become now a horrendous model of how to treat fellow humans. Yes, there are criminals. Yes, they should be chucked out when it's documented that they're criminal activity. Yes, then there's a question where they should be sent. These 240 Venezuelan gang members supposedly are being sent to El Salvador. Why El Salvador? Because El Salvador has made an agreement with the Trump administration that the US government would pay them to imprison these people. This is a kind of lawlessness. This is a kind of behavior. It doesn't matter what your politics are on other issues, but in human terms, the country that used to be, the role model for immigration in many over much of history, and the treatment of people and the integration of immigrants. We all were immigrants once upon a time, right? Unless we're Native Americans, has now been so badly stained that not only have we lost our way, so to speak, in terms of our own constitutional laws and history, but we are, in fact, not a role model for anybody in the world. In fact, our behavior at the moment is much worse than it is in other so-called democratic countries who themselves are having struggles with immigration, refugees, and so forth. But what we are doing, rather than presenting a role model to the world, is in fact presenting an indication of how a country which supposedly is democratic and law-abiding is invalidating most of its constitutional procedures, its way of doing things, and has increasingly, I hate to say this, resembles how an authoritarian government operates. This is very sad. We should all be very sad about it. We should all become activists and help people who might be rounded up for absolutely no reasons whatsoever. And we should very much encourage our lawmakers, insofar we have any influence, that this is a time in the United States to stand up for our values. Our values have never been 100%, but certainly it can be said that the lack of our consistency with our Constitution, our values, is under such attack at the moment that all of us, it seems to me, need to stand up. And there's no better example of the whole refugee immigration issue. It's a worldwide issue. It needs to be addressed. There are problems with it, both with the international law that exists and the current reasons why people are leaving. But this is no way to run a railroad, as the saying goes. I hope you keep yourself informed, because we're all citizens and we all need to speak up, and we all need to, help our fellow humans during these disastrous times for them. Thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 weeks.